Thank you everybody for coming to my presentation on the flipped classroom. This winter I went about changing my classroom and removing the direct instruction through lecture and placing it on in a video format and then placing it on the internet and assigning it as homework. And that change I was hoping would dramatically impact my students. So I'm going to go through the research that I did on the change in the flipped classroom and the impact, but first I'm going to give you some background. So the reason I initially did this change and attempted to take lectures out of my classroom was because I felt that passive learning was not the best way to learn. And statistics and background has shown that passive learning, as we would call it, where you read or you hear or you listen, does not help students as much as active learning. So and active learning would be described as analyzing, defining, and creating and evaluating. And so my concern was if I spend so much time telling the story of history in my class that they're learning in a passive way that we don't ever get to, or we rarely get to, the active learning. And I love this quote by Howard Zinn that says, "History is important, it is not a game of trivia." And I feel like a lot of times in teaching history, we spend a tremendous amount of time in the class with students teaching them the trivia of history and never getting them to actually doing history and asking questions and debating answers, which is what made me passionate and excited about history in the first place. So I thought, how do I get this passive learning out of my class? And there is a certain amount of telling the story that the students need in order to be able to debate history. And I wanted to do that. I wanted to give them that information, but in a more user-friendly format that they enjoyed more, so that they would come to class ready to actively learn. So the research questions that I posed two of them. The primary one was, what effect does a flipped classroom have on the academic achievement of my 10th grade AP European History students? And then the second one was, what effect will the flipped classroom have on the quality of student participation in my 10th grade AP European History class? So again, my goal was to get students to achieve at a higher level, and then also to increase their participation in their active learning in my classroom. And I wanted to see if the flipped classroom, which had been touted by many educators, was going to do that for me. So the setting. I teach at a suburban high school in the East County of San Diego. It is mostly an affluent area. There's a lot of students whose parents maybe didn't go to college, but who are small business owners. So again, we don't have a college-going culture as much. It's starting to develop in my area, but the students come from a rather affluent area. So the money's there. Sometimes the education hasn't followed. I went ahead and decided to make this change of the flipped classroom in my 3 AP European History classes. I had a total of 82 students at the beginning of the flip. The flip lasted from first semester to second semester, so as the flip occurred, I did have some students who transferred out because of the difficulty level of the class. All of the students engaged in the flipped classroom were 10th graders. There was little diversity. It is an AP Advanced Placement European History class, so while there were a couple of students who had special accommodations, for the most part these are GATE or high-performing students, and the ethnicity and the diversity ethnically is pretty low too, but is reflective of the area, which is predominantly white. Confidentiality was maintained throughout this process. In my thesis that I wrote up, names were withheld, and classes were talked about in groups and were given different names so that they would be less likely to be able to identify any of the students or the actual classes. And I've withheld the name of the school as well to increase confidentiality. So previous studies of flipped classrooms claim that they increase student interaction. There's been Legg and Brunsell and Horst G. and Strayer who have all shown in their studies that if you take the direct instruction, primarily they're talking about lectures, out of the classroom and place them online or in a different format, students will increase their interaction in class, and therefore their learning will improve. Collaboration will also be improved because, again, you're not the sage on the stage. You're not talking from the front of the classroom, so it's more likely that students will be involved in activities where they interact. Instruction will more likely be individualized because of the flipped classroom. Teachers have more of an opportunity, if they're not talking to the whole class, to go around to individual students and address their needs. And studies have confirmed that this occurs. There's a picture of Socrates. It's The School at Athens by Raphael over here on the right, and I like it because it shows ideally what would be happening, which is so much discussion, so much activity going on in a classroom that has been flipped, where not one person is necessarily the focus. Additionally, the flipped classroom was, the claim was that it helped at-risk students because it, again, allowed students to slow down lectures that previously would have come at them at one speed by pausing them online. Students liked it because it was convenient, that they, again, could watch it when they had a chance. They could pause it, slow it down, rewind it if they didn't get something. Some students didn't like it because if they didn't get a chance to watch it, they would come to class and they would be confused and unprepared to participate in the activity that was often based on what happened in the direct instruction that occurred in the videos. Students, though, thought that they learned more, and this came about quite often, that they felt they were learning more, even though they understood that sometimes they would become more confused if they didn't do their homework. And overall, almost all of the studies showed that either students' performance improved, as you can see here with Butt in 2014 and Enfield in 2013, and if it didn't improve, there were no studies that I could really find that showed that the flipped classroom was detrimental. It just showed that maybe there wasn't as great of an improvement. But overall, most studies done indicated extensive improvement. So overall, the benefits and the challenges, which are listed in my thesis, are set up here. Benefits, of course, improve student performance, increase flexibility for students. Students do seem to like it for the most part as much as they can like doing homework. Increased collaboration between students, increased interaction with teacher. At-risk students are going to improve their performance, and teachers seem to like it after initial difficulty. Challenges, there's technological problems for students by putting things online for students to access. It's an increased time commitment for students outside of the classroom. Technological problems for educators who have a difficulty creating their own videos, and the time-consuming portion of that. There is a lot more prep time. There's also time needed to create those great in-class activities that replace lectures. And then the accountability of getting students to watch these lectures online and complete online work is sometimes also time-consuming. So the intervention that I took, that I attempted this at the end of last semester and at the beginning of this semester, was to replace a number of lectures from my classroom and put them on the internet so that students would watch the lectures prior to coming to class. They would create debatable questions. They would first take lecture notes. They would create debatable questions based on the lecture notes. And then they'd come to class. They'd get in small groups of 3 where they would discuss their debatable questions and ask for other student input and answers. And then we would return to a large class debate or Socratic seminar where the strongest questions that students had created would be placed to the whole group to discuss and determine what they thought of the topics. I took tally marks of the number of comments that were made and by whom, and then I collected their notes and scored them for 4 points to hopefully keep them accountable. Initially, I would kick out students who didn't watch the lectures because they weren't really benefiting from being, at least I felt like they weren't benefiting from being in the discussions because they had nothing to contribute. This helped a couple of people to be more active about getting their work done. But there was a number of students that no matter what I did, throughout all of the lectures had a tendency to not get all their homework done, or get some of it done and not all of it. And I felt after a while that by kicking them out, I was doing them more harm than good. So I eventually allowed them to remain. There were a total of 6 lectures that were flipped over 2 units, because I don't lecture that often in my class, but it's enough that it'll take up a good 50 minutes sometimes in class if I do a lecture. So all of those things were done. Initially I had discussed doing quizzes to keep students accountable as well, but that became just too time consuming. And so stamping notes, collecting notes, walking around, interacting with the students as they were debating and checking their debatable questions, and then doing tally marks on the discussions were all enough to, I feel like, get a good idea of what they were doing and how they were improving. And then at the end of the intervention, I used a couple of different things to assess whether or not students had improved in their achievement. So I'll go over those in just a minute. Overall, what worked as I observed this intervention was that the interactive class activities were excellent. I got a chance to have them do group work where they were given different topics, and then they created a station where other students went to, and they got to experience 18th century life. And so one was on religion, one was on food and class structure. So those went really well. Other in-class activities that went really well were economic metaphors, and the kids really enjoyed doing that, and they were actually presented in class. The kids love debates and Socratic seminars. The ones that went the best were on war and religion. Students overall liked the videos over reading, but if you gave them an option, they prefer to do neither. And then as a teacher, I loved the individualized opportunity to go around the class as the intervention was occurring and talk to the kids about history in a situation where there were just 2 or 3 of them. And then to hear them talk about history, even though they were off topic quite often, when they did get on topic, there were some really cool things that happened. So in order to diminish the time that the students were off topic in their small group discussions, I think checking notes is probably not enough. There might need to be some kind of form that the students fill out as they're in the small groups to keep them on topic a little bit more. Students may need in the beginning more instruction on writing debatable questions, because my first time I went around, some of the questions weren't really debatable. They were more lower level questions. Videos, students consistently said, and I agree, need to be shorter. The videos need to be placed on a YouTube or some kind of medium that allows for students to access it using computers as well as cell phones, all different kinds of devices. The flipped classroom takes a lot of time to make these videos, and so there was not enough time to create weekly quizzes, but I think as your videos get made and stuff, if you can go back and create weekly quizzes, it may help to reinforce the information that you want them to get. And then the tendency of students sometimes in the Socratic seminars was to let other people talk and not to express their opinions. And so one might want to create have the students write out their answers to the Socratic seminar before going into the Socratic seminar so that they're more likely to talk. These are just ideas. But overall, the intervention went really well. So qualitatively, what I did was I observed the students, their level of interaction versus the passive lecture-oriented experience that I had had before. I had the students take pre and post surveys to find out their own reactions, and then I did collect student work samples And then I also took some pictures of some student work samples just to get an idea of the level of analysis that they were doing. The quantitative results were I had the students take a couple of multiple choice tests after flipped classroom lectures and experiences to see how they did based on previous multiple choice tests they had taken earlier in the year. And then they also took a couple essay tests. One was a document-based question and one was a free response question, both of which require extensive, full 4, 5, 6 paragraph essays. And to see if their essay writing improved after they had been more interactive and debating issues. Did their essays become more analytical? So what were my findings? Well, let's look at my first question. What effect does a flipped classroom have on their academic achievement? Overall, multiple choice tests are going to improve. The improvement, as you can see here with the flipped units, I did one flipped unit and then realized that that wasn't enough, so I added some more lectures and did another flipped unit. And while Unit 3 consistently, except for this Section 3, was a pretty easy unit and kids did really well, Unit 4 had been a struggle, except for my Section 2. So the flipped unit, their scores all increased the first flip unit. Now, again, this was the first unit of the new semester, so kids were highly motivated, I think. The second flip unit I did, the scores leveled or dropped a little in Sections 2 and 3. Section 1 seemed to benefit quite a bit from the multiple choice, the new format of lectures online. What I will say is that when I take some of these sections are pretty small, so when I put all of them together and then looked at their multiple choice average scores, they did improve by about 6 points. So we went from about 55.8 to an average of 60. Now these are on multiple, that sounds bad initially, but for AP tests, it's not unusual for scores to be in the 60%, and that's actually really good for students. My best students will get 80%. So this shows you that for an average score, they were doing much better. Again, this was an average of the units 1 through 4 tests versus the post-flip 7 and 8 tests. So again, you do see a great improvement. So then I went on to what happened with their writing, and the DBQ was the most impressive, and they did show tremendous gains. Pre-flip DBQs for sections 1, 2, and 3 range from 2.66 on a rubric scale of 9. And this is hard. These are sophomores, and it's the first time they've ever written like this. So initially they were really struggling, and then after the flip, going from a 3.6 to even section 3 here having a 4.43, that's a really good DBQ score. If they could do that on the advanced placement test, I would be very happy. So definitely an improvement in their writing on document-based questions, which tells me that they're analyzing better and they're organizing better. And I want to, and I think I can accurately attribute this to the flipped classroom because I went ahead and did a DBQ comparison of the topic and last year's students. So last year's students consistently were stronger students anyway. It was just a stronger group of kids. They struggled less. They were writing on DBQ number 2 at a 4. And then they did their second DBQ, or this other Manchester DBQ, and they got 4.79. Excellent scores, which is a gain of a little less than a point on the rubric score. Now, this year's students, they went from a 2.82 to a 3.94. Same topic, all that kind of stuff, but their gains were much higher. And so the flipped classroom improved the DBQ scores by actually, if you take this into account, even after you negate the 2 gains here and you say, okay, this is 1.12 and this is 0.775, they actually had a rubric score gain of 0.345 that cannot be associated with much else. I mean, they're the same topics, same time of year, so it's not even just natural growth. This is based on improvement in actually their learning, and I believe it is related to the new flipped classroom style and the more interactive students who are interested in talking about topics in history, and it comes out in their writing, which is what I expected. The FRQs, when flipped, showed tremendous improvement too. So the sections are broken up here, and you can see that they did an FRQ in Unit 2 and in Unit 4, and then they go and do one in Unit 7. And except for Section 2, who had gains over their first one, but had dropped a little, and it could have been because of the difficulty of the question they chose or whatever, but for the most part, FRQ scores were going up. Now, I wanted to see if this had to do with natural increase. They're getting better at writing FRQs over time. So I went ahead and looked at last year's FRQs. And based on last year's FRQs, it appears that over time, really, there isn't a lot of improvement. So I can't make the claim here that it's based on the flipped classroom, because with no flip last year, they improved by 0.22. And then this year they improved by 0.21. So it could have a lot to do with they're just getting better at writing. But again, this group was a weaker group, and they showed about the same improvement, which really is encouraging to me because they do struggle a lot more this year. So what effect does a flipped classroom have on academic achievement of my 10th grade AP European History students? Well, my conclusions would be this. I think the flipped classroom improves their academic achievement. I believe, and I showed that their multiple choice scores improved. Their DB scores improved, and their FRQ scores showed some improvement, but when controlling for time of year, the scores were relatively the same as last year. Now, last year's students were exceptional, so again, I just feel like we need to have a larger sample and a more long-term study to be able to solidify whether or not the flipped classroom is really going to make the difference. So my recommendations would be that multiple choice scores should be compared with non-flipped classes on the same test, which I didn't do this year because my test changed. It would be nice also for the multiple choice to see if we can control for content and time of the year. Students do get better on multiple choice tests, but less so over time than they do on their essays, because content varies so much that students, they'll understand the Renaissance really well and then fail to understand anything about the Reformation. So it just really depends on content for multiple choice. But I'd like to see how students do a non-flipped classroom versus a flipped classroom on their multiple choice test scores. I'd love a larger sample size. That's hard to get when you're doing advanced placement classes, because it is a small group of students who are able to take advanced placement. And then I could not control for the FRQ writing topics. I know that I have been a little harder on this year's students than I was on last year's students by not revealing the topics ahead of time, which is a huge challenge because some kids can get really low scores because they misunderstand the question. So I'm pretty sure last year I revealed the topics ahead of time, but I'm not positive because I hadn't intended on doing this action research this year, so I didn't know what information I would need to keep from last year. But anyway, it would be nice to know whether or not their FRQs were really equally, I mean, they showed improvement. It'd be nice to know if it was an equal relationship when I compared it to last year's students, or whether or not I was being unfair to this year's students because I had given last year's students more information. Anyway, there's a lot of things I don't know, and a lot of things that I think need to be taken care of in order to understand if the flipped classroom really works, but it definitely showed improvement. In addition to seeing that improvement in their test scores and in their writing, I think the real thing for me that I saw was I liked my class and how it ran better with the flipped classroom. It just felt better. It felt like learning was taking place. So the effect on the flipped classroom on the quality of the student participation in my AP class, I felt like was pretty extensive. So Socratic seminars and small group discussions. We had only had two all year prior to the flipping of the classroom, and here within like a 4 or 5 week period we had 7 Socratic seminars and 7 small group discussions. some of the questions that arose during classes were, was it beneficial to the revolution to allow women's clubs? Was the Republic good for women's rights? Did women attain their goals during the revolution? Should women stay in the public or private sphere? Did women help or hurt the revolution? And we're talking about the French Revolution. But these are really great questions that college level students would be asking and would be asked to think about. And the students came up with those questions. More students were involved. I was able to have more individual discussions with students, and a greater variety of students were asking questions, and I was able to hear them actually speak about history instead of just seeing their faces and never hearing them talk. So Socratic seminars, the number of comments, semester 1 and semester 2, there was no difference over time really between how many comments occurred. You will see kind of a weird thing over here where, because of time and what we were doing, one of my sections never got to actually do a large group discussion. They did a small group, but then we ran out of time. But overall, pretty consistent. Based on the topic, sometimes it would change, but about the same number of comments each time for the sections. I didn't really see a trend one way or the other. So that tells me that students enjoyed and wanted to comment. But I did see this. Participation was definitely greater in classes that were smaller. The section 3 was my largest class, and it had a tendency, except in some rare circumstances with the debate on the Catholic Church, to inhibit students from speaking. So you've got 0 here, but that's not really fair. 24, 13, 8, 30, 19. But if you go and look at the actual, in my study, you go and look at the actual number or percentage of students who were participating based on how many students were in that section. Section 3 had the smallest percentage of participation. So there were certain students, and they were commenting a lot, but overall the number of students that were participating was less. So students do not naturally increase participation over time. Participation was greater in small classes. And you can kind of see here the total number of participants. So in this smaller class, you had 10, 14, 8, and 11, 14, and they didn't do the last one. So given that there was a lot of students in that class, like 36, I think that's pretty low. Whereas this other class that had 12, 21, 8, 12, 18, 14, there were only 22 students in that class. So this one section, this one day on the Catholic Church, almost everyone spoke in a large group discussion, which is pretty significant. So conclusions, again, about the effect that the flipped classroom had on the quality of student participation in 10th grade AP European history classes. It's exceptional at providing time for collaboration and discussion that I wouldn't have originally had because I would have been talking to them about history and giving them what I felt would be trivia. Students really enjoy the discussions. They looked forward to them. Participation was greater in smaller classes, and students did not naturally increase participation over the time. My recommendations would be to create a form to guide small group discussions, have students write a response to the Socratic seminar topics prior to the discussion. Maybe create hot seats so all students are forced to participate. And ideally, having smaller class sizes would be awesome. So do you have any questions about the flipped classroom and the process of putting lectures online and removing them from the classroom so that more interaction and debate can occur?